physical distancing, and alternating work schedules. We have faced all of this while surviving the stressors of life and a global pandemic, which often feel like just enough and sometimes far too overwhelming to manage. The social climate and events of the last year brought to national and global attention the systemic racism and prejudice that historically marginalized groups, particularly Black Americans, still face. The archives, its collections, spaces, and staff are not exempt. In response to these events, we saw organizations, including SCAA, release statements and plans to acknowledge the atrocities that happened and to affirm their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. All good things to do, but this is not enough. As things start to resemble normal, or shall we say normal 2.0, since it's still changing and new, we stand at a crossroads as keepers, users, stakeholders, and friends of the archives. We find ourselves facing new opportunities to connect through virtual conferences over Teams and Zoom, new renovation projects, new ways to offer services to users via virtual consultations, and new physical and digital collections, many of them focused on documenting life during the COVID-19 pandemic. In our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, may we be careful and intentional in identifying and diminishing demographic gaps in our collections, and correcting dated and offensive language used towards historically marginalized groups in archival description in our catalog and metadata records, and in our finding aids. This standard should also be upheld in providing equitable access to the archival spaces themselves, the spaces we share with our colleagues and stakeholders, reaching far beyond what we see as our typical stakeholders, and in the SCAA organization and board. May we be intentional in not recruiting underrepresented minorities and those employed at institutions which house the collections of predominantly historically marginalized groups as members just to have seat holders and to check off a box. But may we see each other as valued colleagues and voices with which we all seek to include and learn from, or learn how to include and engage with, even if DEI is not in our training. May we approach all of these new opportunities with the same and enduring enthusiasm, heart, and mission to steward our collections, preserving, collecting, and providing equitable access. Today's slate of presenters and keynote speakers will explore this crossroads where we stand and give voice to the decisions that we're making or will need to make as we envision the future of our collections and institutions. We thank each of them for sharing their ideas, aspirations, and challenges. I encourage everyone to use today and the days after to make connections, to engage during the sessions, and to reflect when recordings are made available. And finally, we are thrilled to share space today with our keynote speakers, Jermaine Fowler, author and producer of the Humanity Archive, and Micah Brotnax, project manager for the Black Teacher Archive at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who will both tell us about their work relating to archives and the crossroads we face. And now I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Hello and welcome everyone. I am excited to be here today and eager to learn from you all in this collaborative space. I am SCAA's first year director, Erin Alsop, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the archivist for Central Piedmont Community College in Charlotte, North Carolina, right across the York County, South Carolina border, where I preserve the history and heritage of Central Piedmont and its preceding institutions. Before we roll in today's schedule of wonderful presentations, I would like to make the following land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge that the South Carolina Archival Association virtual conference, hosted in present-day South Carolina, has been the homeland to dozens of indigenous tribal nations for thousands of years. While many of these tribal nations no longer exist, the Catawba, Pee Chicora, Edisto, Santee, Yamasee, and Chicora-Waccamaw tribes are still present, as are the descendants of the Cherokee. Today, the many places in South Carolina that bear the names of our Native ancestors attests to the important role Native Americans play in South Carolina's history. A land acknowledgement statement is a critical step for the South Carolina Archival Association towards working with Indigenous communities to secure meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. As an organization, we will continue our work to honor and acknowledge the Native inhabitants of this beautiful land and provide a safe space to hear the wisdom and resolve of our ancestors. Let us take a moment of silence to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. Thank you. And now I will turn it over to Tabitha again.
Thank you, Erin. So this morning, we have the pleasure of having Jermaine Fowler as our opening keynote speaker. But before we introduce Jermaine, we have a few things that we would like to cover as far as the logistics for our session. Just a second. Okay, so here's our meeting information for today. You can enter, leave, and switch sessions at any time. We have some concurrent sessions that will be occurring later in the day, so you may do so. In this particular session, you may have on your video, so you may turn on your video because we will do a gallery view. I believe Jermaine wants to see faces today as we go through his talk. So you are free to do so. But in other sessions, we ask that you keep your camera turned off. There will be 15-minute breaks between each session to stretch, get a beverage, or whatever you need to do. Sessions are being recorded. A recording disclaimer will appear once the recording begins. If you decline to be recorded, you will have to leave the session. Zoom will automatically kick you out. As much as we love you to stay, that is just the way that Zoom works. And then finally, only at the business meeting will questions be handled. Questions will be handled in the chat, except for at the business meeting, or if the presenter says that you're free to unmute yourselves. So I'm going to stop the screen share. And I believe we should be open to our gallery view now. And Erin, would you like to take over in introducing Jermaine?
Yes, absolutely. So our morning keynote speaker is Jermaine Fowler. Jermaine is an author and producer of the Humanity Archive, a groundbreaking history podcast exploring the untold stories of history, as people seek to expand their knowledge of overlooked history, much of which has long been excluded from textbooks and mainstream conversations about marginalized heroes, thinkers, and revolutionaries. The Humanity Archive fills the void. More information can be found by visiting www.thehumanityarchive.com. The link will be posted in the chat shortly. And we are excited to have Jermaine here with us today and hear his experiences with podcast creation, historical research, and passion for the preservation of marginalized communities. Jermaine, thank you so much for being here with us today. And without further ado, we'll let you take over. Thank you.
Well, just want to say what an honor it is to be here today. It's a privilege and a blessing to be here today for the South Carolina Archival Association annual meeting. Definitely want to give a special thanks to Erin Alsop for inviting me here today. Tabitha Samuel for her input on this program. If I was in person, I'd ask everybody to give you all a round of applause. I really appreciate you all. Now, I am from Louisville, Kentucky, but I recall the 2 years that I spent living in Savannah, Georgia, and we would drive to the Low Country over to Beaufort, places like the Penn Center on St. Helena Island over there. And I remember immersing myself in the history of the school for the newly freed enslaved people who were educated there. And we'd go over and we'd explore the traditions of the Gullah people, reflecting on not only the vicious legacy of slavery in this country, but also how the Gullah people were able to retain a unique African heritage, this beautiful hybrid culture. And they were able to do this because the plantation owners would often leave the Gullah people alone during the summer months and rainy seasons to escape yellow fever, malaria. So the Gullah people were isolated, insulated, and I do apologize, my screen just went down. Sorry about that, but yeah, the Gullah people were isolated, insulated, so they were able to retain their family values, their food, their traditions, their language, their music. So I remember those like Louise Cohen over there on Hilton Head Island as someone who was working day in and day out to keep that culture alive, because a lot of that history is being lost. A lot of the young people are moving away, poverty, wealth inequality. They're not engaging with the history as much. So you have people like her over there that I remember who were just trying to keep that history alive. So I know South Carolina, I know your history. South Carolina is a very special place. Now, a little bit about me. I am Jermaine Fowler, as I was introduced. I am the host of the Humanity Archive podcast. I am the creator of the Humanity Archive website, and I have a book that's going to be coming out also titled The Humanity Archive. And what I consider to be my greatest mission is twofold. One, I would always want to tell the stories of the historically unheard. It's mission number one for me. Number two is I want to be a voice for the humanities. Now, I realize that's hard now because in America and American culture right now, it's very science-driven, STEM-driven. And people are focusing on things that are objective, experimental, things that can be proven with numbers. Funding for the humanities is decreasing. Schools are shuttering humanities departments. And as archivists and librarians, you all are engaged with and involved with the public humanities. So I do want to salute each and every one of you who are the keepers of the records, the books and the artifacts, because what you do is extremely valuable. We are documenting and preserving the human experience. And while there's such a focus on science, right, we have to remember that science needs the humanities. Science, without the humanities, we forget that science should be used in service to humanity. So I think that with this focus on science, science wants you to prove something, right? But you can't prove a human experience, but you can tell about a human experience. So my work is to see what the archives have to tell us, to see what the books have to tell us, to see what the art has to tell us, to see what the oral history has to tell us. So that for me is the evolution of the Humanity Archive. And the Humanity Archive is the evolution of my entire life. I've always been a bibliophile, always been a logophile and a thinker. I remember those moments whenever I was a kid in middle school. I realized that I didn't see a lot of Black history represented truthfully in textbooks. The books I grew up with in school didn't show the nuances and complexities of the Black experience. There were questionable interpretations, and these interpretations, particularly regarding racial issues and minority groups, were rendered invisible. I remember that I didn't see a lot of women in the history books, not a lot of Native Americans. I can't tell you even one Asian American that I learned about by name in a history book in school. So what I did was I didn't live that far from the Free Public Library. So I went to the Free Public Library, and believe it or not, it was a librarian who changed my life. And like I said, I didn't live that far from there. So I went and I asked where the Black history section was. And the librarian not only led me there, but she was excited to show me books, hand me books that other people had checked out. Said, here, like, this is where you need to start. So I remember that moment. And from that moment, like, my library card literally became one of my favorite possessions. I've stayed in the library from that point forward. And that's when I started to get my philosophy and really fell in love with the archives. And I really started living what one of my favorite quotes is. It was by Erasmus, and he says, whenever I have a little money, I buy books. And if I have any left, I buy food and clothes. I've lived that. My friends thought I was crazy because they were out tossing footballs and doing that, but I was going up to the library every other day and hanging out in the in the aisles and looking at old microfilm and looking at old magazines and books and really studying history, philosophy. And it was here where I realized that this was a way for me to gain compassion and understanding for the people around me. It opened the door not only to history, but it opened the door to philosophy and unlocked the boxes that contain music and art and everything that the humanities had to offer. So this is where I began to craft my personal philosophy. And it boils down very simply to what Afro-Roman playwright Terence said. And he said, I am human, so nothing human is alien to me. So what does that mean? That is a philosophy that is humanity affirming in a world that is so often humanity denying. And it speaks to this idea that we have to be human first. We have to look at other people and see a mirror to ourselves. So I knew then that I had to keep humanity at the center. I had to deal with real people and have the attitude that no one is a stranger to me. And that's ultimately why I called it the Humanity Archive and not the Black History Archive, because I wanted to use the archives as a bridge to connect us all, and just always keep in mind that we are people who live, we are people made of flesh and bone, we're born, we hope, we despair, we all die, trying to keep these things that we all have in common at the center, and look at the archives as a way to connect us. But then also remember that it's not just about information, it's about transformation, and it's a process of questioning assumptions and critical thinking. And I think that it's impossible to talk about the archives without talking about how we bring the archives to the community. So I'm always thinking of ways of how I can bring history to the next generation, engage them with history. A lot of them think that history is boring, the archives are boring, but I'm trying to meet them where they are so that I can bring these stories in innovative ways to meet them where they are. And I do think we're at a crossroads. How are we going to bring the past into the present? As James Baldwin said, we are trapped in history and history is trapped in us. So how are we going to teach this value of history in this digital age where information is everywhere? People think they know everything a lot of times. So a lot of times they're not as receptive to knowledge because they think that information is everywhere. So how do we connect with the community and bring the archives to life in such a way where they see where it's valuable to their lives today? So these are the things that I'm thinking about every day as I work and I study history and I teach history. And for me, I think that we have to move beyond the talk of just archival activity as just a discussion about preservation. And we have to acknowledge, of course, I've got books all around me. I've got some expensive books that I bought, and it is about preserving the books and the archives and keeping them from a state of decay and damage. But more often I think about how can we use the archives to keep humanity from a state of decay and damage, democracy from a state of decay and damage, connectedness from a state of decay and damage, civic engagement from a state of decay and damage. And I think that we are also at a crossroads in the fight for diversity. Some of you here probably from historical societies and colleges and other places like that. And I think that you have to ask yourself, what manuscripts and documents am I curating? One of the historians that I've studied, his name was E.H. Carr, and this very much applies to what stories we tell. He said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, historical facts are like fish swimming in an ocean. And what the historian catches will depend partly on chance, but mainly on what part of the ocean they choose to fish in and what tackle they choose to use. This is going to determine what type of fish they're going to catch. So for me, looking back at history, I see that the part of the ocean that most people have been fishing in is Europe, right? I see that the part of the ocean that most historians have been fishing in are white history spaces. So for me, it's about accessing the whole ocean, making sure that I'm telling the stories of everybody, not just fishing in this one exclusive part of the ocean. And I think that we have to apply that focus to everything we do as we look through the archives. What type of collections are we displaying to the public? And it depends on where you look, and that's what you're going to bring to light. So I think there's also this myth of objectivity. I had read about an archivist named Hillary Jenkinson in 1948. She said that archivists should leave their own views aside. They should be detached, they should be impartial, they should not leave any mark on the inscription on the archive. And she went on to say that the archivist shouldn't be seen or heard. They should be like a robot, essentially. But we do leave impressions on the archive. Up through the 1970s, archivists spoke mainly through silence. And of course, now it's been acknowledged that the appraisal process, the selection of certain histories excluded minority groups, excluded Black people. And I have an example of that. I have done a lot of study on the Underground Railroad, and this is played out a lot in history. There's this myth that's prevailed through history that the Underground Railroad was only due to humanitarian, compassionate-hearted, good-willed white people saving downtrodden Black people, discounting the agency and legacy of the Black people and abolitionists on the Underground Railroad. And up through the 1960s, most of the Underground Railroad histories and papers emphasize the abolitionist efforts of white men, rarely referencing the efforts of Black people like William Still and Sarah Parker Redmond and Ellen Craft and William Craft, all these overlooked Black abolitionists that were left out of the collection. They were left out of the books, left out of the archives. And of course, it played into the white superiority, Black inferiority framework, that idea that Black people had no history. One of the white abolitionists named Levi Coffin, he went as far to style himself as the president of the Underground Railroad. And he said about Black involvement that there were only a few Black managers on the Underground Railroad and they couldn't be trusted. They lacked shrewdness, they lacked caution. They could be bribed to act as spies or betray the hiding places of other fugitives. But then you come to find out that Black people were the main conductors on the Underground Railroad. And what's very interesting about this is this history still coming to light. Around about 2014, an undergraduate student was digging through some old boxes at Columbia University, and they found hundreds of Underground Railroad accounts that were previously unknown. So there's this treasure trove of accounts taken down by this New York journalist named Sidney Howard Gay, and he interviewed people as they got to New York City between 1855 and 1866. And he had a Black man with him named Louis Napoleon. He would meet the people as they made their way to the north, take them, they would give them money or whatever they needed, and then Louis Napoleon would also escort them to their next destination further north. So I thought about this, and I think, if it's the archivist's job to decide what stories are getting told, if it's the archivist's job to decide what history is important, if it's the archivist's job to decide what history is getting valued, the fact that these rich historical accounts were shoved in a box somewhere in a corner of the archive tells you a lot of what you need to know about exclusion in history, right? And it just makes you wonder how many other stories like this have been hit back. This story of the Underground Railroad, right? It shatters all the myths, it debunks all the myths, it tells the stories from the people themselves who were on the Underground Railroad. There's a story about a Mary Curtis, and she was 19 years old. She was enslaved by a man named Ben Gwiner of Chester County, Maryland, and she was a housemaid, and Gwiner died. In this account, it reads in this way of where, she was about to be sold, and another free Black woman induced her to leave, told her, go, now's your time, get out of here. The other Black woman gave her money and paid her way to Philadelphia. So right there, you see Black agency in the Underground Railroad. She had to leave her father and mother behind. So there's all these themes of courage, themes of separation from families. Like in one paragraph, you can get a lot out of what really happened on the Underground Railroad. So there's hundreds of these stories that were taken down, people telling their stories, and they just shatter so many myths about why people left, how they mostly left individually. There was no big network really of people hiding people in holes and doing any of this stuff. It was just people who were just fed up, and they, left sometimes in families. Sometimes, most of the time they left alone though, to have a better chance of escaping. So this shows how the archives have not only excluded, but how we need to look for those stories and bring them back. Now, I think for me, as someone being on the outside, working outside of institutions, I think that a lot of times what I notice is a passivity, and people might look at these stories like it's business as usual. But I think unless you have a genuine interest in the stories that you're telling, if you don't have a passion for the stories that you are bringing forward, then you most likely aren't going to bring these stories forward beyond a diversity initiative. I think that we have to realize that we have to focus on the humanity. It's not just Black. There's so many other stories. There's something called the Matilda effect, named for the 19th century women's rights advocate named Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And it refers to how female scientists were literally written out of textbooks, written out of the archives. The research was stolen. Men took the research and got Nobel Prizes for it. Their husbands would take their work and just exclude them. And I think, again, it's about how can we tell a full story? Talk about Native American history, those like the Yamasee and the Cherokee. How are we pushing back against what is the most dominant myth in American history, the myth of the frontier? Cowboys versus Indians, American regeneration through violence, savages to be tamed, savages to be subordinated and dominated, then sophisticated, civilized people taking over their land and saying, lo and behold, there's nothing here but buffaloes and Indians, right? This is the myth of American history. How are we pushing back against that? And I think that the lies, the mendacity can only survive for so long. Now we see, if we don't tell the stories, history is going to tell the stories. We see the precious Native American babies that were found in mass graves of the history, the graves cry out, the rocks cry out, the history tells the story. And it's up to us to tell the story as well. Like, we can't wait for that. So again, it's about, for me, it's about how can we go back and literally we have to rewrite the wrongs of history. So that's the crossroads that I think we're at. And I think that we, again, have to ask the question, how are we cultivating an archive that is fully representative? How do we push back against the intellectual narrowness that has segregated the archives in the first place? Because we have this narrowness that says African civilization, or it has said and continues to say that it's unworthy of consideration, only condemnation. Then it turns around and says, well, hey, Native American civilization is unworthy of consideration, only condemnation. And then those marginalized groups, and I see this more and more, they internalize that intellectual narrowness, and then they turn around and say, well, hey, wait, then Western civilization is only worthy of condemnation and not consideration. So it's a reciprocal effect. So how do we get beyond that? Well, I understand the frustration, though, because I understand that the reason that so many Black archives were created in the first place, the reason they're proprietary and the reason they're insulated was the reasons that they started in the first place. The Black archives weren't just started because, you know, Black people love books. They were started out of interest, of course, but also that they were having to use the history to combat racism and all those histories that said Black people were inferior. So you had those, like a man named William Dorsey. He was an archivist out of Philadelphia in 1896, and he's making scrapbooks by hand. He transformed the whole top floor of his row house into an African museum. He's got all these old pictures and paintings on the wall by Black artists. He's a bibliophile. He's got books stacked up everywhere in his house. He's got old volumes of Phyllis Wheatley's poems, originals from the 1700s, and letters from Sojourner Truth. And he's got hundreds of handmade scrapbooks. And Dorsey gave it his mission and goal to uplift all the Black history that he could and Black achievement that he could to push back against those ideals of racial inferiority of his time. So this is the reason why the Black archives got started. So I understand that. I understand that frustration and isolation and people wondering if America is ever going to fulfill its promise, right? And Dorsey basically said it's his continual aim to get every piece of Black history that he could get his hands on. And that's how he lived his life. And now I have found out that the Dorsey archive reflects the concerns of so many archives now. Underfunded, they're in a room somewhere that's not temperature controlled, so they are at risk of deteriorating year after year. So unless they're moved, they will slowly deteriorate further. And I think that underfunding, of course, is a problem for a lot of institutions, but I think about the HBCUs and this is where a lot of this history is located. And I think about how a lot of that history is in danger of being lost. I actually had a Stanford student where the King Institute is in those archives, and the student was telling me how she was appalled about how like the King papers were not being maintained properly. They were in like this old building, and she said people wouldn't believe at this prestigious institution such as Stanford of how Martin Luther King documents and papers could be in such disarray. I couldn't believe it myself. I had to look into it. So I think it's about how can, again, and you think it's just a thing of larger institutions that are more well-funded helping and coming together with smaller institutions, but then you find out that a lot of those more well-funded institutions, they're turning their back on the Black archives as well. So I think this is a conversation that's needed to be had for a long time, and it's good that it's happening now. I think that as people who are preserving the archives, we have a profound responsibility for the control and the description, rather, of information. I have a personal observation. I am from Louisville, Kentucky, as I said, and just thinking about the legacy of slavery here, there was not a massive need for enslaved field labor in Kentucky because there's a short growing season here, but there was still a massive slave economy because of us being situated on the Ohio River. We were heavily involved in the transportation of enslaved people. So in the 1990s, the city did a good thing. They wanted to place markers wherever the slave pens were located here in Louisville. So they did that, and the markers say something to the effect of slave trading in Louisville. It talks about how in the 1850s, annually, we exported between 2,500 and 4,000 enslaved people downriver to the larger plantations in the South. So there's this whole history that it tells about very concisely. And historical markers are important. There's a beautiful one I remember of Robert Smalls over in Beaufort when I went over there. And always fascinated by Smalls. He was sent to Charleston in 1851, and he held several jobs. He was sent there by his enslaver. His love of the water led him to work on the docks. He became a wheelman. He became knowledgeable of the Charleston Harbor. And then in 1851, I remember just this fascinating story about him, how he steered the CSS Planner, an armed Confederate military transport. And then on May 12th, 1862, the 3 white officers that were on this vessel, they were spending the night on shore. So the next morning, early morning, Smalls and several other Black crewmen decided to make a run for the Union vessels and that formed the blockade. So this is daring escape by Smalls. He rescued himself, his family, and other people's families. So I remember just thinking about all that as I was standing at the marker in Beaufort. But as far as Louisville, though, there was the last sentence stood out to me, and this is where I talk about descriptions and our responsibility, right? Because the last section said, slave traders were often social outcasts to be avoided by all but fellow traders. Now I thought about that because I know the history. I was like, were they? I did my research, and the average person who's walking past this marker, what are they going to get from that sentence? They're going to think, well, hey, Louisville, there was slavery in Louisville, but Louisville as a whole took a negative attitude towards slavery when it existed. It was frowned upon in Louisville. I think that's going to be the takeaway from that sentence. But what they don't know is that by 1860, the population of Louisville was 68,000, and there were over 300 slave trading firms plying their business in Louisville. They were constantly advertising in the local newspapers. What that person looking at that description also might not know is the newspaper in Louisville was owned by a man named Henry Watterson, who was, after the war, an avid Confederate apologist. What they might not know is by 1865, the Kentucky General Assembly refused to endorse the 13th Amendment. So while they acknowledged it in practice, symbolically, Kentucky didn't even acknowledge the 13th Amendment and adopt it until 1976. A man named Henry Bibb, he escaped to Louisville as a fugitive, and he described Louisville during that time as walking through a wilderness among wolves and vipers blindfolded. So this doesn't sound to me like a city that only slave traders, there were these social outcasts, right? It seems to me as though the city of Louisville openly was embracing slavery. But then you have a historian and archivist who decided to put that sentence in there, and that's a minimization, a sanitization of history in my mind, in my eyes. So again, we have a responsibility to tell the real story, the full story, the real history. I think that's what people always quote Napoleon when he said, history is but a set of lies agreed upon. That is what people end up thinking about history when they find out the truth behind things like this. When they read the full story and then they look at a marker like that and see that it didn't tell the whole story, they start to turn their backs on whether history is telling the truth, whether we are telling the truth, whether people are telling the truth about history. But then I think about W.E.B. Du Bois, who gives the challenge, right? It's a challenging statement that he gives, and he says, nations reel, they stagger on their way, they make hideous mistakes, they commit frightful wrongs, they do great and beautiful things, but should we not guide humanity best by telling the truth about all this, so far as the truth is ascertainable? So he's challenging us. Why aren't we telling the full, whole truth of history? There's good and bad. We have to tell it all. So again, I think we have a profound responsibility as to how we are presenting and describing information. And it goes back to me what the ancient Greeks called veritas. Veritas being this commitment and spirit of the truth for the sake of the truth. And it has been said that in a time of lies, telling the truth is revolutionary, right? So there's all this misinformation out right now. And it seems to be a revolutionary act to be able to go against the grain, to be able to tell the truth in a time where so many lies are being told. And I think that we have to acknowledge that the truth is not always going to be pure, it's not always going to be simple. There's going to be some painful realities, and it takes profound courage to work outside of the way that things have always been done, acknowledging that so many of our institutions that deal with the archives have been and are predominantly white, and to a degree, they have been self-insulated, maintain the silence, maintain the neutrality about the minimization and racist language that has been used in the archives and the descriptions of the Black community. So whenever I started the Humanity Archive, I knew that I couldn't be neutral. You know, I had to take a stand. I had to let people know where I stood on, you know, my engagement with history. And of course, I want to be, I have rigorous scholarship, present facts, and really do that. But also, I don't pretend to have a neutrality. I tell everybody right off the bat, like, I am going to tell the stories of overlooked people, and I am trying to bridge humanity. Like, that's what I'm trying to do. There is no neutrality. So I think when I tell a story, especially on the podcast, I focus a lot on Black history, but I don't only tell Black history. So what I do, for instance, when I'm telling a story about a group other than myself, I'm always asking myself, am I using language that is respectful to the larger community of people that are most invested in this story? I did a podcast on Japanese internment, for instance, and I centered the Japanese voices in the sources because so many times we heard the story of the military leaders, and you know, they had a lot of times the perspective that the Japanese internment was justified because of Pearl Harbor. But, you know, a lot of those stories don't tell about how people lost their homes, they lost their businesses, you know, and those are the stories that the Japanese people, Japanese Americans, were telling about their own history. So those are the stories that I chose to center in my exploration of that history. Same thing with a podcast I did on Pocahontas, centering the oral history of the Mattaponi tribe, because you get so many of the, you know, Virginia history, the, you know, John Rolfe history, that version of history, but again, the Native American version, totally different, way more tragic. It's not a Disney-fied version at all. So there's a whole nother story to be told with that history. So again, I'm centering humanity first and having a reverence and an honor for humanity. So that, for me, is what it's all about. It's recognizing the history is not a spectator sport. I'm active in the history and telling the stories from my unique perspective. And I think that we have to be aware too that a lot of times when we dig in the archive, we're going to find some things that are going to be unsettling, they're going to be unhousing, they're going to be unnerving. And then also, though, using the language to match the atrocity, not softening the language. because I think that the truth, when we tell the truth, it deals on equal terms with hope and despair. So I did a podcast on Ida B. Wells Barnett, the anti-lynching crusader, and she was this courageous journalist, just a fascinating woman in history, and somebody I think to uplift in American history. But in 1898, the Department of Justice was bombarded with letters concerning the lynching of South Carolina postmaster Fraser Baker. His precious 2-year-old daughter was killed with him as well by a mob on February 22nd. And Ida B. Wells was one of the people who sent a lot of those letters to the Department of Justice. She actually went to the White House for 5 weeks to petition for justice and indemnity to be paid to the family there. So when I tell the story, when I did a podcast on Ida B. Wells, when I tell the story about the lynchings, people taking pictures of it, being sent off on postcards, I didn't soften any of that. The history had to be told in all of its fullness, atrocity or otherwise. I never try to sugarcoat the history because the truth is not always bright, it's not always positive. So I do think that we are at a crossroads. I think that we have to make a decision as we move forward. Are we going to move forward in a way that perpetuates the structures that have excluded so many from the archives and from history? Or are we going to work to tear down those structures and keep what I always like to think of as a tragic sense of history, a history that is deeper than just buzzwords like equitable access and cultural sensitivity? I'm talking about a deep sense of humanity where you preserve the stories of everybody, because you know that no civilization, no people have a monopoly on love, on wisdom, on virtue, on civilization. So you're always trying to pull from all the stories. There's no either or perspectives, just recognizing that it's about complexity, it's about subtlety, it's about more than just a narrow sense of diversity and inclusion. It's about an all-embracing moral vision, because when you have a tragic sense of history, I think it should generate a sense of empathy and sympathy in trying to identify with the frustrations of others. People who look different from you, people who come from different places than you. It was Simone Wells, she said, love thy neighbor in all of their fullness, being able to say to him or her or them, what are you going through? Can I be of service? I think that is the spirit that I try to study history in. And I'm very glad that you all are bringing the community in and having this conversation, going against the grain, because right now we live in such a moment of xenophobic frenzy, and people are closing ranks and getting tribal, and people are isolating themselves into groups. But we know that when people put up these thick walls, this makes it very difficult to build the kinds of bridges that we know are necessary, not only to build a sustainable, but a just society and world. So it's not just about colorful symbolic representation in the same hierarchy. I think that we have to realize that this is not the best we can do to honor the history of marginalized people left out. We have to develop, maintain relationships with communities different than our own. So this is what I hope to see out of archival associations. This is what I try to cultivate within myself. The question always being, what kind of human being am I going to be? And I hope that everybody asks themselves that question as well. What kind of human being are you going to be? What type of traditions are you going to place yourself in? What kind of history are you going to locate yourself in? And most importantly, what kind of legacy are you going to leave? And I'm not here to be self-righteous. I think we're always learning, we're always growing. One of my favorite quotes is by Samuel Beckett, where he says, try again, fail better. Try again, fail better. That's the story of our lives. We're always at crossroads. We're at a crossroads right now. I think that we have difficult decisions. And again, we have to ask ourselves, which way are we going to go? We're going to take some wrong turns. We have to reorient ourselves. And I think we always have to keep a moral compass and always heed the words of Dr. Martin Luther King when he said, an individual has not started living until they can rise above the narrow confines of their individualistic concerns, but they need to rise to the broader concerns of all humanity. So I appreciate you all. Always try to make this world a better place. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for inviting me.
Jermaine, that was wonderful. I've been jotting down all the names you've referenced, the points. The Matilda effect is something that I didn't know about either. There's so many new things that I've learned in this talk, and there have been some questions that came through the chat. The last one that I'm looking at was actually my own. What are some challenges you have faced with creating the Humanity Archive, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, there's been several challenges. I think for me, the biggest challenge is trying to figure out how to tell stories different from my own, because, you know, a lot of times communities, they kind of feel like they want to tell their own stories, but I think that I've been able to bridge that gap by just letting everybody know, like, it's about humanity. Humanity is the baseline, right? So I think that people have started to connect with that, but it's also difficult as well to deal with some of these painful histories sometimes, right? These things that I really feel, especially a lot of the atrocities of history, when you're reading these firsthand accounts of what people went through, of their struggle, of their tragedy, and what happened to them. Sometimes it can get, you know, it could get emotional, it could get, you know, painful. But I always like to tell myself that, like, these stories need to be told, right? These people would want their stories to be known, and they don't need to be forgotten. So that keeps me moving forward. But that's definitely a challenge sometimes, is to tell some of the harder histories.
Another question came in from Tabitha. Jermaine, can you discuss your process for creating narratives that humanize historically unheard communities? What narrative was the most difficult to develop?
I think the Ida B. Wells was the most difficult podcast that I've ever done, because of the lynching atrocity. If you read some of the accounts, I mean, it's like reading a script of a horror movie. You know, some of the things that happened to people during this era of racial terror, Jim Crow. And that was a very, I mean, of course, you know, and you hear about it just in more of a loose way, but when you start to read these firsthand accounts, that was difficult. So that was definitely my hardest history to tell. And, you know, I think that I just keep going for the reason I said, though, you know, these stories have to be told, they have to be heard. And I think my process, what I do is I always, again, keep humanity at the center. So when I look at a story, I'm looking specifically for the voices that are left out. So when I get the books that I'm going to get, I'm always getting them from the perspective of the people who are left out. So whether it be a Native American story, I'm sourcing every book, every firsthand account that I can of Native Americans, and then kind of reversing the process. A lot of times it's where the European or the white perspective is centered, and then it's supplemented by the marginalized voice. Well, I center the marginalized voice and then supplement that with European sources. So I just feel like that's something that I need to do to counterbalance the narratives, because we already have heard we've already heard of that side, so we need to hear the other side. So I make sure to center those stories, and then that's kind of like my process as far as how I move about studying these histories.
Another comment earlier I didn't want to miss. Shamela had mentioned, thank you for bringing up William Henry Dorsey. I hope to learn more about him and his drive to document Black history. Another question came in. How do you believe how do you balance the horror and the stories of pain for those historically unheard, which seem to be more prevalent, with those of joy and happiness?
Yeah, that's a good question. I appreciate that question. I think that, you know, a lot of Black people are, you know, they'll tell me they're tired of hearing about slavery. You know, they're tired of hearing about the horrors. They're tired of hearing about the atrocities. So I think there is a huge focus right now on Black joy, on Black achievement, on Black agency. And I definitely respect that, and that has changed my framework a lot of thinking, like just this whole conversation. I think it's important, like rest and all these different things, right, to balance. But I also realize too that it's about balance. So there's been a lot of imbalance as far as people only focusing on the atrocity, but I don't think we can only focus on the joy either. But I do try to balance every story that I tell with achievement, with agency, not just people getting pushed, but people pushing back, not just pain, but also joy, not just sadness, but also happiness. So I'm always looking to balance the scales and make sure that I tell both sides of the story, not forgetting either side. So that's how I try to balance that and tell the stories of joy. And then sometimes I'll just tell stories that only strictly deal with achievement, joy. But unfortunately, the history of racism is what it is. Even these stories of joy, these people still had to push back against. If you tell the story of, say, I was reading about this group of Black doctors, and the stories weave themselves in of what they face. So I mean, I might personally want to tell this joyous story of these Black doctors who just did their medicine and they saved all these people, but ultimately the story always unfortunately includes racism, the things they faced, the things they went through. A lot of them wrote about it themselves. They didn't exclude it, so if they didn't exclude it, then I can't exclude it either.
Well said. Another question came in. As archivists, how can we make doing research like yours easier? Any examples of the things that work very well? And what are some common barriers that you have encountered or currently encounter?
I think for me, I mean, the first thing it starts with is what makes it easy for me is passion. I just have a passion for every story that I'm telling, a passion for bringing the stories forward. So that is my fuel to dig as far as I need to dig, or if it takes me an hour to find a fact about an obscure figure, like I'm willing to do that because I want to tell as full the story as I can. So I would imagine that everyone here is passionate as well, but beyond that, it's difficult for me sometimes because I talked about this with Aaron and Tabitha before, but somebody like me on the outside of institutions, I feel like there's a lot of times a block of like, how can someone from the community have access to the archives? There's historians who've written great books out of the archives, and a lot of people don't have access to that information, so they're bringing forward even the story about Sidney Howard Gay and those Underground Railroad archives. A white historian got a hold of, he had access to those archives. I don't think there's still a lot of exclusion where he was able to tell that story. And I see that like a lot of the history books are these obscure histories that came forward. And then you have certain groups of people who have access to that. They're able to write groundbreaking history books out of it. But I feel like there's not enough done to bring these Black people, marginalized people in so that they can look at the archives and be able to tell those stories from their perspective as well. So that's one of the challenges I face. And I'm trying to see how I can connect in with archivists, librarians, and put my white gloves on and come back and flip through some of those art archives so I could tell those stories from my perspective. So that's a big challenge.
I was just thinking about your mention of the historical placards and markers throughout it was Louisville that you were mentioning. Mm-hmm. And one thing I was thinking of is, have you had conversations with those marker creators to talk about maybe changing the wording, updating things? If you haven't, that's okay. I was just curious.
Yeah, that's something that I did think about. It's something I do have on my radar. I did a talk here where I brought it up. There was some people who were very involved in history of Louisville at the talk that I did. I have yet to reach out to, it was the Historical Association here who wrote that. So that is something on my agenda to do because I think it is important. Whether they decide to change it or not, I'm not sure, but at least to make them aware of, my perspective of how I think that they're minimizing the history. So that is something I do plan to do.
Well, for me, this has been an absolutely enriching and fascinating talk. I want to ask our audience if you have any more questions. We have a few more minutes, but if not, we may wrap up early. Oh, we do have one coming in from Shamela. She has asked, how can people support your work?
Yeah, so right now, I mean, go ahead and follow me on social media so you can find out when the book's coming out. I do have a book coming out in 2023. It's going to be called the Humanity Archive. It'll be distributed everywhere. But right now, I do take donations for my podcast on Patreon at the Humanity Archive. So I just have it set up. You can donate, I mean, anything from $1 a month to whatever you want. So just a kind of a tip, you know, for the work that I do. So you can do that as well. So I do appreciate you asking that question and your interest in supporting me. So thank you.
So are you at the Humanity Archive on all social media platforms?
Yes, if you see it, Humanity Archive, everything. If you search in Google, it'll come up. Patreon, the Humanity Archive, all social media, the Humanity Archive. So you'll definitely find it if you Google it and everything you need to know.
Perfect. And Erin has left a comment. She said that for those that are involved in research, she has incorporated the Humanity Archive into a list of resources that she shares with students. And she's added some of your works to her LIP guides for her institution. So that's awesome that your work is being incorporated.
Appreciate that.
So
yes, sorry.
Oh, you go ahead.
Oh, all I was going to say was the reason why I think that's important is because especially working at a community college, a lot of our students, this is their first year. A lot of our students are coming back to obtain their GEDs, to, you know, even just, you know, take the first try or the multiple tries at, you know, getting a secondary education degree, right? And a lot of our students who do go off to four-year institutions are not necessarily prepared for research by the time they arrive. So a lot of what we are trying to do is introduce them to archival processes and archival research, but take a more general approach, just, you know, not necessarily focusing on what we have at our institution, but archives in general. And your work has been really influential, especially because of your background. You have mentioned that, you know, yes, you're not an archivist, but you have a passion for it. You're not necessarily a historian, but to me you are, because your passion exudes. And I think you're just a wonderful example of, you know, what could come out of, you know, the work that you put in is the work that you can get out of it. And you're just an inspiration in so many ways. So I found that your work has been, you know, really, really inspiring. And even with the podcast creation overall, I mean, you touch upon tech, you touch upon different stories that aren't necessarily incorporated or have been incorporated before. And I'm always learning from you. So I think that others should be able to have that same opportunity. So, and it's something that we'll talk about in my presentation later, but I just wanted to share that with you right now. Thanks.
I'm humbled, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
And I completely agree. The work that you do is phenomenal. I have listened to the Humanity Archive. I've listened to the very one about Ida B. Wells Barnett, which was just completely fascinating. I studied her in college, but just hearing from an added perspective in a way that humanized her in a way that I hadn't even heard before was just moving and fascinating and really just affecting my perspective even more. So we're just happy to have had you this morning, and I have learned so much more during this talk. And I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking Jermaine for this morning. I guess we're going to wrap up a few minutes early, but we do have our next session starting at 10:30. But everyone, let's give Jermaine a round of applause. And we truly thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And for starting off our conference, we really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Awesome. So everyone, we will conclude now. And so we'll have a longer break before our sessions start at 10:30. And we'll see you back at 10:30 for 2 sessions. So be well.